Central Asia, social issues, identities, and external influences.
Central Asia's story cannot be told without confronting its environmental and nuclear legacy. During the Soviet period, Kazakhstan's steppe was chosen as a testing ground for nuclear weapons. Between 1949 and 1989, more than 450 nuclear explosions took place at the Semipalatinsk test site. The region was treated as a wasteland where the costs of empire could be absorbed without consequence. Villages near the site were never evacuated, and residents were often not even informed that tests were happening. The result is a long shadow of cancer, birth defects, and psychological trauma that still haunts communities across eastern Kazakhstan. Survivors describe entire families afflicted by illness and children born with severe health complications.
For decades, silence and secrecy surrounded the issue. But after independence in 1991, Kazakhstan became one of the most outspoken countries in the world on nuclear disarmament, not out of idealism alone, but because of lived tragedy.
Equally devastating was the Aral Sea catastrophe. Once the world's fourth largest inland sea, it was drained by Soviet planners to expand cotton production in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. Moscow declared cotton the white gold of Central Asia, and entire economies were reoriented around its cultivation. Rivers that fed the Aral, the Syr Darya and Amu Darya, were diverted into massive irrigation canals. By the 1980s, the Aral had shrunk dramatically, and fishing communities that had thrived for centuries collapsed almost overnight. Dust storms carrying toxic salts now sweep across the region, spreading disease, contaminating soil, and making agriculture ever more precarious. In towns like Muinak in Uzbekistan, once a vibrant port, rusting ships now sit stranded in desert sands, stark monuments to the consequences of central planning gone awry. These disasters were not accidents. They were the deliberate outcomes of policies imposed from Moscow that prioritized cotton quotas and military might over ecological balance and human survival. Independence did not end these challenges. Water disputes continue to be among the most sensitive regional issues. Upstream countries like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan control the headwaters of the great rivers, while downstream states, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, depend on these waters for irrigation and drinking supply. Every summer, when the need for irrigation peaks, disputes flare up. Tajikistan's construction of the Rogan Dam has been a constant source of friction with Uzbekistan, which fears reduced water flow for its cotton fields. In Kyrgyzstan, Toktogul Reservoir is used for electricity generation, which requires water releases in winter, directly conflicting with downstream agricultural needs in summer. Thus, water is not just a technical or environmental issue. It is a deeply political one, linking sovereignty, economics, and regional security. To understand Central Asia today, one must recognize how the legacies of environmental destruction and resource disputes continue to shape interstate relations and domestic politics. From these existential challenges of health, water, and environment, we turn to another defining issue: identity and language. During the Soviet period, language policy was not just about communication. It was deeply political. Russian was deliberately privileged as the language of administration, higher education, science, and upward mobility. Local languages were never completely banned. Schools operated in Kazakh, Kyrgyz, or Uzbek, but they were increasingly confined to the private and cultural sphere. Mastery of Russian was the key to a career in the party, access to universities, or a job in Moscow. In practice, this meant that generations of Central Asians became more fluent in Russian than in their so-called native tongues. Independence in 1991 radically changed the language landscape, but not in a uniform way. All the new states declared their titular language, Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Uzbek, Turkmen, or Tajik, as the official state language. Yet, the political will, resources, and speed of de-Russification varied greatly. Kazakhstan, is a revealing case. On the one hand, the government has promoted Kazakh as a marker of national identity, introducing it more forcefully in schools, administration, and public signage. On the other hand, Russian remains not only widely spoken, but also legally recognized as a language of interethnic communication. This dual system reflects Kazakhstan's complex demographics, its large Russian-speaking population, and its geopolitical balancing act between Moscow and the West. Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, by contrast, moved more decisively away from Russian. In Uzbekistan, the shift to Uzbek in administration and education was accelerated, and Turkmenistan under Saparmurat Niyazov went even further, actively marginalizing Russian. These policies were not just linguistic choices. They were statements of sovereignty and deliberate steps in cultural decolonization. In Turkmenistan, the campaign was so aggressive that many Russian speakers chose to emigrate. By contrast, in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, Russian retained a far more prominent role. One reason is economic. Hundreds of thousands of Tajiks and Kyrgyz work as migrant laborers in Russia, sending home remittances that make up a significant share of GDP. For them, Russian is not just a prestige language, it is a lifeline to jobs and survival. In both states, Russian remains a language of higher education and administration, and efforts at revival of national languages are more hesitant and fragmented.
This struggle between Russian and national languages reveals something deeper. At its core, it is about sovereignty and cultural decolonization. Choosing which language is taught in schools, used in courts, or displayed on street signs is never neutral. It signals the extent to which states in Central Asia are trying to move out of Russia's shadow, or conversely, the degree to which they remain tied to Russian influence, whether by choice or necessity. For area studies scholars, the key point is this: language revival in Central Asia is not simply about culture or education. It is a political act that reflects power relations, identity formation, and contested visions of the future. Language also ties directly into questions of media. During the Soviet period, information was centrally controlled, with Russian-language newspapers, radio, and television shaping the intellectual landscape of the entire region. After independence, media environments diverged. Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan developed relatively pluralistic landscapes, though still constrained by state pressure, while Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan maintained far tighter controls. Russian media continues to play an outsized role, especially through television and digital platforms, which remain influential across the region. In Kazakhstan, Russian state channels are still widely available and shape perceptions of international politics, often competing with Western and local narratives. In Kyrgyzstan, Russian remains the default language for many urban dwellers, making Russian-produced media a central source of information. By contrast, Uzbekistan has tried to limit Russian media penetration as part of its cultural decolonization, promoting Uzbek language programming and tightening information control. The result is that Central Asia's media space is a contested field where local, Russian, and increasingly Western or Turkish outlets compete for influence. Another crucial issue shaping the social and political fabric of Central Asia is media freedom. Since independence, all 5 republics have struggled with varying degrees of press restriction, state control, and censorship. In Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, especially under Islam Karimov and Saparmurat Niyazov, the media was little more than a government mouthpiece, with tight controls over what could be published or broadcast. Even after leadership changes in Uzbekistan, reforms remain cautious and incomplete. Turkmenistan continues to rank among the most closed information environments in the world. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan show more variation. Kazakhstan presents itself as modernizing and open, yet independent journalists often face harassment, lawsuits, or tax inspections when they publish material critical of elites or large companies. In Tajikistan, the deterioration of press freedom accelerated after the civil war of the 1990s, and independent outlets have been gradually squeezed out. Kyrgyzstan is the outlier. It has historically enjoyed the freest media landscape in the region, especially after the Tulip Revolution of 2005 and the 2010 upheaval. Yet even there, recent years have seen growing pressure on critical voices, reflecting how fragile media freedom remains when governments feel insecure. Equally important is the rise of digital and social media. While traditional media remains heavily censored, platforms like Telegram, YouTube, and Instagram have created parallel arenas where new debates unfold. Independent bloggers and citizen journalists now reach wide audiences, sometimes rivaling official state outlets in influence. This development is double-edged. It provides spaces for dissent and creativity, but also exposes societies to disinformation, manipulation, and state surveillance. At its core, the struggle over media freedom in Central Asia reflects the same dilemma we see in language policy and corruption, the contest between state control and societal self-expression. Controlling the media allows elites to protect their power, but it also stifles innovation and narrows the horizons of political debate. For younger generations, especially urban, educated, and digitally connected youth, this raises profound questions about what kind of future they want for their societies, one shaped by censorship and conformity, or one open to competing voices and pluralism. The problem of corruption cuts across all these sectors. Weak institutions, centralized power structures, and dependence on resource rents have created fertile ground for corruption in all Central Asian states. From Kazakhstan's oil and gas sector to Kyrgyzstan's customs service, rent-seeking has been pervasive.
The Kazakhgate scandal of the early 2000s, in which Western oil companies were accused of paying bribes to secure contracts, revealed how resource wealth and international business intertwined with local patronage networks. In Kyrgyzstan, frequent changes of government have been accompanied by revelations of massive embezzlement and illicit enrichment by ruling elites. Uzbekistan under Islam. Karimov was notorious for using the cotton economy as a system of forced labor, enriching elites while exploiting rural populations. Even today, despite reforms under Shavkat Mirziyoyev, forced labor in the cotton fields remains a scar on Uzbekistan's international reputation. Corruption is not just an economic problem. It is a political one, undermining trust in government and fueling social discontent, especially among the younger generation that demands transparency and fairness. Religion is another central axis of transformation. Under Soviet rule, Islam was heavily controlled, confined to officially sanctioned religious boards, and stripped of much of its social influence. After 1991, a religious revival swept the region. Mosques were built at a rapid pace, and Islamic education expanded. Yet governments quickly grew wary of independent religious movements, fearing that political Islam could challenge their authority. This has led to a delicate balance, encouraging Islam as part of national identity while repressing groups seen as politically threatening. In Uzbekistan, for example, independent imams were targeted during Karimov's rule, and thousands were jailed under suspicion of extremism. In Tajikistan, the civil war of the 1990s left a lasting legacy of suspicion toward Islamist movements. Kazakhstan has been more tolerant, but even there the state has moved to regulate religious life closely. The result is a patchwork of religious revival and control, where Islam serves both as a source of personal identity and as a political fault line. Demographics complicate the picture further. Central Asia has one of the youngest populations in Eurasia, with a large share under the age of 30. This youth bulge brings both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, it means dynamism, energy, and a potential demographic dividend. On the other, it means pressure on labor markets, education systems, and migration pathways. Millions of young Central Asians have left to work abroad, primarily in Russia, but increasingly in Turkey, South Korea, and even Europe. Migration has become one of the defining experiences of the post-Soviet generation. For families back home, remittances are lifelines, but they also create dependency and vulnerability to external shocks. The COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's war in Ukraine showed just how fragile this system can be, as migrant workers lost jobs or faced discrimination. At the same time, migration fosters new identities. Young Central Asians exposed to global cultures bring back new values, ideas, and aspirations, sometimes clashing with traditional norms at home. This generational divide intersects with gender. Women in Central Asia face persistent inequality, particularly in rural areas where early marriage, limited educational opportunities, and domestic violence remain significant issues. Yet women are also at the forefront of social change. In Kazakhstan, women's rights activists have organized protests demanding stronger protections against gender-based violence. In Kyrgyzstan, the fight against bride kidnapping has become a major social campaign. Across the region, educated urban women are increasingly visible in business, academia, and civil society, pushing back against patriarchal structures. Gender is thus a site of contestation, where tradition, religion, and modernization collide. Beyond formal institutions, power in Central Asia is often organized through informal networks, clans, kinship ties, and regional affiliations. In Uzbekistan, clan politics long shaped the balance of power between Samarkand, Tashkent, and Fergana elites, even if President Islam Karimov publicly downplayed their importance. In Kyrgyzstan, the North-South divide has repeatedly influenced leadership struggles, making the country the most politically turbulent in the region, with two revolutions in 2005 and 2010. Tajikistan's political landscape is similarly marked by regional loyalties, especially between the dominant Kulyab faction and others marginalized since the civil war. Even in Kazakhstan, where institutions appear stronger and politics more centralized, regional and kinship ties quietly underpin elite networks and business alliances. These clan structures can both stabilize regimes by providing leaders with loyal support bases and destabilize them when excluded groups challenge the balance of power. Understanding Central Asian politics requires looking not only at constitutions and parliaments, but also at these hidden webs of loyalty and competition. Another sensitive but telling issue is LGBT rights. Central Asia remains among the most conservative regions in the former Soviet space. Homosexuality is still criminalized in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, punishable by prison sentences. In Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, same-sex relations are not illegal, but public discussion of LGBT issues is heavily stigmatized, and activists face harassment, police raids, and occasional violence. Attempts to introduce anti-propaganda laws similar to Russia's have surfaced in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, though not always passed. At the same time, urban youth subcultures, small NGOs, and digital communities have created new spaces for visibility and solidarity. For many, LGBT rights are not only a human rights issue, but also a litmus test of how open and pluralistic Central Asian societies can become. The way governments respond, whether by repression, indifference, or cautious tolerance, sheds light on broader patterns of state-society relations, authoritarian control, and cultural conservatism. Bringing these threads together, we see a region shaped by overlapping legacies and contested futures. The nuclear tests and Aral Sea tragedy remind us of the costs of empire and central planning. Language revival and media battles reveal the ongoing struggle for cultural sovereignty. Corruption and weak institutions expose the fragility of governance, while demographics, migration, and gender highlight the social pressures of modernization. Above all, Central Asia remains caught between larger powers, Russia, China, the West, and Turkey, each vying for influence, while local societies grapple with their own visions of identity and independence. The story of Central Asia since the 1990s is thus not one of linear progress or simple decline. It is a story of adaptation. Authoritarian regimes have learned to manage dissent, but civil society has also found ways to express itself, from women's rights campaigns to environmental activism. Economies remain dependent on resources and remittances, yet new sectors, from IT to renewable energy, are emerging. And while external powers loom large, Central Asian states have become increasingly skilled at balancing, playing Moscow, Beijing, Ankara, Brussels, and Washington against each other to preserve room for maneuver. As we look ahead, one central question remains. Will Central Asia's young generation accept the legacies of the past, environmental destruction, corruption, authoritarianism, or will they carve out new models of governance and identity? The answer will depend not only on domestic choices, but also on the region's ability to navigate the pressures of global geopolitics. In this sense, Central Asia offers us a window into the challenges faced by small and medium states in a world where empires have fallen but power politics remain very much alive.